welcome to session 6. We're talking about benchmarking your deductions for Kroger specifically. And like I said, my name is Allie Trong. I lead the content team here at Supply Pike. And then Ryan, you are an OG Supply Piker. You have been here pretty much since it started, I believe, correct?
It's somewhere close. Yeah, I was in the first 10 employees or so, about six and a quarter years ago.
That's awesome. And your title here is senior product manager. And honestly, if we had to put every product that you touch and all the teams you work with, it would be going off the page. So today we are just saying that you are on the deductions navigator for Kroger, but I know you touch a lot of other products. And I'm really excited to have you walk us through today's content. And with that, again, we're running a tight ship. So we're going to talk about Kroger deductions, what they are, how they affect suppliers. We're going to talk about disputing Kroger deductions, and then we're going to share with you some insights that we have based on some of the supplier data that we have access to. So with that, I will kick it over to the FAQ slide. If you've been with us today, you know the gist. This is old hat, but no need to take screenshots or notes. We're going to send you the deck when we're done, and there also will be a recording of this session and the rest of the sessions today. But feel free to take notes and take screenshots and share them as we're doing today's session. And then again, we have lots of questions today. So if you want your question seen, go ahead and put it in the Q&A tab on Zoom. But if you want to just be a part of the discussion, this is a learning community. So go ahead and put that into the chat, and we would love to hear from you. And again, we've kind of said this a couple times if you've been on today's conference, but we're Supply Pike. We create cloud-based tools that help CPGs minimize revenue loss. And we've been talking all about deductions today. And today we're going to get into Kroger. But if this is the first session you're joining, we basically focus on a lot of revenue loss, whether that's deductions or OTIF fines, other compliance programs. And we are in Walmart, Kroger, Amazon, and Target. And Amazon actually launched today, which is super exciting. But with that, I will go ahead and kick it over to you, Ryan, because we have a lot of content to get into.
Yeah, thanks, Allie, and glad to be with you all today to talk about Kroger AP deductions. So we're going to share some of the data that we've kind of analyzed and compiled across, thousands and thousands of deductions and disputes that we've seen in Kroger system. So excited to share those insights. But before we do, I want to make sure we're on the same page about what are the types of Kroger deductions that we're specifically referring to here. There's lots of different ways that retailers can kind of nickel and dime you. So just want to make sure we are on the same page about the deductions that we're going to go over today. So as many of you may know, if you're in Kroger, you can find all of your deductions, your own invoices to Kroger, the payments made from Kroger, all in the Levante portal, which is created by PRGX. So this is actually a free portal for all Kroger suppliers, so you should have access to it if you like. Levante is also the place where you would dispute most of your Kroger charges, but definitely all of the deductions that we're going to be talking about today, those accounts payable deductions, are disputed in Levante. So just to sort of narrow down exactly what we're talking about with accounts payable deductions, this is when Kroger or any of its related banners, so Fred Meyer's and Ralph's and Roundy's and all those fun Kroger banners, this is applies to them all. And so when Kroger is going to pay one of your invoices, and their accounts payable team sees a problem with the order that was received or the invoice related to that order, and they say, for some reason, we are not going to pay you in full for that invoice, they create this accounts payable deduction. And each deduction line typically includes kind of the item information like the UPC and description, It also includes, how many units are affected and at what amount each unit is deducted. And then they also supply a deduction code and kind of a generic short code description. So that's the kind of data that you see on the deduction lines. And all that results in Kroger paying you less than what you billed them with that deduction. So types of Kroger deductions, we're going to cover kind of the most common 8 deduction types, just to give you, again, a clear idea of what are the deductions that we're benchmarking, so we're on the same type of page. So these are the most common types of deductions. We're going to go through these one at a time. And at the bottom of this slide is actually what the deduction looks like in the Levante portal. So if you open up an invoice payment from Kroger and you're looking at that payment detail, there's an associated deductions table. And those are the deductions that we're talking about today. There are other chargebacks, and we'll get to that on the next slide, but these deductions will have kind of that deduction code, usually a single or 2-digit number, again, with that code description and the item that it was related to. So mention the other side of the coin. So we are talking about AP deductions. I just want to throw a quick mention for the other common charge scenario with Kroger, and that is more of an accounts receivable fine. So this is when Kroger creates an invoice themselves, and they are basically issuing that invoice to you, and it's payable to them. So if you see a charge related to an invoice number that you do not recognize, it's not one of yours, then that is generally going to be an accounts receivable fine. And these include scenarios of compliance related charges or ORAD. It also could include post-audit charges, returns, all of those and more. Promo allowance is another common AR fine where they are basically creating their own invoice payable to Kroger. So typically suppliers do not actually pay this back to Kroger. So what Kroger does is a netting process where they take all the money owed to them and they balance it against what they're paying to you. And so the ultimate sort of check amounts are balanced based on what they owe and what you owe to them. So that's the netting process, the accounts receivable fines. That's not what we're covering today, but I did want to give a mention to that type of chargeback. Okay, so getting into these common AP deduction types, and this is based on, again, data from a lot of different suppliers. These are the most common deduction codes with Kroger. So starting out with promotional allowance difference. So this is usually when an allowance is deducted by Kroger because it was not already deducted on the invoice. So if you have a promo running with Kroger and your invoice does not reflect that promo allowance, then they may take it with this code 2 deduction. So trade promotions, co-ops, those types of things. And of course, those are typically an agreement for certain items for a certain time period. And so the, question is did they take it for the right items, or did they potentially take it on a wrong item or for a wrong date range? That's kind of the research that you would typically do on these. So hopefully that gives you an idea of just in general what this type of deduction is, but it is a code 2. So if you see that in your deductions, that's what that is. Code 3, on the other hand, is similarly labeled promo cost difference or list costs, sometimes depending on where you're looking. This is generally a pricing discrepancy. So when you bill Kroger and you are, saying we are billing you at this price per unit, Kroger receives that invoice and says, well, we actually believe we should be paying you less for whatever reason. And so they pay you the less amount and they create this list cost deduction to reflect that difference. And these can be disputed. Typically, we see these a lot of times around the time that price changes are happening. We'll talk more about sort of how to research and dispute these, but its pricing discrepancies are generally this kind of code 3 deduction. So code 4 is definitely, so there's a couple of shortage codes we're going to get to. I'm sure most everyone on the call is familiar with shortages, a fun headache we've probably all dealt with many times. So this is one of the 2 Kroger codes that is specifically related to shortages. And that is, of course, whenever, there's a difference in the number of units that you have billed Kroger versus what they have actually received. So we'll touch on this much more, but general description, that's what the shortage is. Code 5 is probably one of the least common out of this group, and that is related to how you transmit the invoice to Kroger. So if you submit it sort of manual upload to Levante instead of sending the invoice via EDI, then you're definitely at risk of getting this code 5 deduction. It can either be a flat fee of $250 or 1% of the invoice amount, but usually it's related to not sending in the invoice via EDI. Code 6, so I mentioned there's a couple of shortage-related deduction codes. This is the other one that is specifically kind of shortage-related. So this is when Kroger's received an invoice, but felt that they did not receive cases of that item that you billed for them, like any cases. And sometimes this is a scenario where, they truly didn't get any cases. But there also is a scenario where this kind of pairs with code 7 or overage, which we'll talk about now and how they relate. So code 7 overage is when Kroger actually pays you for either additional cases that they didn't order, but you shipped. They may pay for those additional cases for an item that they did order. Or if what happens pretty commonly is a supplier may ship a very similar item to what was billed or ordered by, what was ordered by Kroger, but maybe packaged differently. So instead of a 4-pack, you send a 12-pack or something like that of generally the same item. So when that happens, they will create a code 6 shortage for that item that you billed them for, but they feel they did not receive. They'll just deduct that entire billed amount for that item. And then they'll create a code 7 overage deduction for the item that they did receive. And in this case, it's actually a positive amount. So the negative code 6 deduction and the positive code 7 overage amount can sometimes offset each other. Sometimes the code 7 just partially offsets the code 6 and you still have an overall net sort of deduction amount. And in some cases, of course, you just have a code 6 with no related code 7 on that same invoice. But hopefully we do see this pretty often. It's generally best practice to, if you do substitute items, to try to make sure your invoice reflects that item that you substituted. So you don't have this kind of, accounting work to dig in to see what happened. Okay, so just a couple more codes here. Code 8, net total dollar difference. So this is a fun one. It involves research typically to try to understand what caused this type of deduction. And basically, Kroger says they issue this deduction code whenever they receive an item that they ordered, but it arrived in different packaging than what was billed for. So this is like packs versus sleeves, or cases versus eaches, or pounds versus units. A lot of times it's related to that unit difference between what was received or what was ordered versus what you billed. So if you billed for eaches and then they actually ordered cases, and there's going to be some difference in, the price per case versus the price per each. So you have to do a little bit of legwork to review the purchase order, see the unit type that was ordered, see the unit type that was actually shipped, and then see the unit type that was on the invoice. And that, once you see all of that, that will give you an idea if this is a valid deduction or not. Sometimes, the deduction is going to be valid if you actually shipped a different unit type than what was on the invoice. But sometimes there still could be an error, and this could be shortage related or price related in terms of how you would dispute it. So this is definitely one of the more complicated ones, but I would especially pay attention to the unit type on the PO, the invoice, and what was actually shipped. Okay, last one, code 9, pickup allowance. So if you are a collect supplier to Kroger and Kroger comes to pick up the freight from your facilities, then they will basically charge this pickup allowance and they'll take this deduction. So a lot of times this is a valid deduction. We have seen some scenarios where, if you ship a mix of collect and prepaid, then sometimes Kroger incorrectly applies this pickup allowance to a PO that was not picked up by Kroger. And in that case, you could potentially dispute. We'll talk about data to include on those disputes, but sometimes, if you're only collect and you're always collect, this is probably going to be a valid charge. But if you ship a mix of collect and prepaid, then sometimes we do see this as an invalid deduction taken. So hopefully that gives you guys an idea of the types of deductions we're going to be talking about in this benchmarking data. So we're on the same page. We do want to kind of quickly give you some insight into disputing these Kroger deductions. Obviously, a lot of us are here to recover these dollars. So just want to give you some highlights on the disputing process with Kroger. Of course, some deductions can be invalid and you can dispute those Kroger deductions. A couple of notes, you only have 180 days from the payment date to dispute those deductions. So a quick, tight window, 6 months to dispute is all you have. Again, PRGX is the one that hosts the website, and sometimes there's a mix of personnel between PRGX people and Kroger people reviewing these disputes. So Kroger has published some resolution times. They say it takes around 3 months to respond and resolve most disputes. If you kind of dispute unpaid invoices, they're a little bit quicker. We'll show you some benchmark data here shortly to see how they actually do in terms of timeliness. And if you have more kind of Levante questions, a good area for research, if you log into Levante, on the left side of that first page, there's a help FAQ section where you can see videos, articles, letters from Kroger, et cetera, documentation that could help you understand some of these concepts. So a good place to check. All right. So in terms of actually creating a dispute in Levante, just want to give you a few steps. I see Allie's popped up. So do we have some questions?
Yeah, I was going to say, maybe we should jump to the benchmark data just in the of time, because we do have a question that I've been holding kind of towards the end, but up to you, Ryan.
Yeah, I'm totally good with it. So, the dispute process in Levante mostly involves going to your invoice payment, clicking that create claim button, and you get this form to fill out to create the claim, attach your documents, and submit. So it's pretty straightforward in Levante to actually dispute these. This is kind of our first benchmarking slide, really, because so out of all the claims that have been submitted, these disputes, we've kind of identified, what are the best claim types to use per deduction code. So in this slide, I won't go through all of these, but you can see out of all the data we've analyzed, this is typically the claim type that's picked per deduction code. And if you get this wrong, then Kroger will kick it back or deny it. And you don't want that because sometimes they take 3 months to respond to your dispute. So you don't want to sort of, set yourself up for failure and have to wait for 3 months for that to happen. So definitely recommend generally using these claim types when you fill out a dispute on this slide. And then we've also got dispute proof per deduction code. So again, I won't cover all of these, but this is the type of documentation that we typically see submitted per dispute of these deduction codes. And I'll just highlight a few here. If you are disputing a price discrepancy, any emails with your Kroger merchant on when they approved that price change are going to be really important. Of course, invoice copy. For shortages, shipping documents, of course, are going to be the most vital documents to winning these disputes. If at all possible, if you can get a signed proof of delivery with the Kroger stamp, where their DC stamps that POD to show that it was received, and if it was received in full, that is the best dispute proof you can possibly provide to give yourself the best shot. So I know if you're collect, that's harder to get. You can potentially reach out to their DCs to ask them for this information, but just a sort of best practice to try to get that POD with the Kroger stamp if possible when you're disputing those shortages. So I think those are it for the highlights, and we can skip right on to kind of some of the other benchmark data. So in terms of timeline of what we see in terms of Kroger responding to these disputes, based on the last year's worth of claims submitted, thousands of claims, the average time is somewhere around 2.5 months, so 76 days from submitted to approved. It takes about that long. And that's pretty similar whether they approve it or deny it, or sometimes they'll kick it back to you and ask for an update. It's right around that timeline. So there's almost no scenario where they're very quickly getting back to you. Sometimes, of course, individual disputes can be quicker or longer, but that's kind of the average timeline that we're talking about. And with a 180-day dispute window, you can redispute these charges, but you have to do it before that 180 days from the payment date expires. So if you're looking at the average timeline, you really want to be disputing in the first 2 months after the deduction is issued to have a chance at potentially redisputing if they throw it back to you and say, this is denied because you didn't supply X documents. So if you do it quick enough, you have a shot to take a second stab at it and actually get a successful dispute in. So one note there, approved to paid only takes 2 days. So that's great. After they approve it, they pay you back pretty quick. And then this is kind of the last slide here. So in terms of win rates that we see across the board, it varies quite a bit depending on the charge type. Shortage, as I mentioned, is the most common deduction type that we see. And the win rate is on average low. It's definitely lower than what we see with Walmart and some other retailers. But I will say that we've seen individual suppliers with much higher win rates. And so I think if you can get that sort of POD that's stamped by Kroger, that is the best case scenario at, increasing your chances of winning these shortage disputes. A signed POD without the stamp would kind of be the next best dispute proof. And followed by that, the signed bill of lading with the packing list would be, the next best. So it's not super high on average, but we do see some suppliers with much greater success. So I think that you can be successful if you have the right dispute proof. Some of these others you can see are much higher on average than what we see. So a lot of pricing discrepancies that are one. The majority of those. Late shipping is kind of those ORAD, late shipment deliveries. So if they were incorrect in their delivery date, we're seeing a lot of those paid back. And pickup allowances, again, if you ship a mix of collect and prepaid, we see a fair number of invalid pickup allowances taken where you can dispute those with a shipping document. All right.
Awesome. Ryan, this is great. Thank you for leading us in this. I want to jump to some of the questions before we have to go to the next session. So thank you for being with me as I'm running through this. First question here, before Kroger pays an invoice, they send us a settlement document. Do you know why Kroger does this? And is a settlement maybe more like a post audit? What does that situation look like?
So sometime I believe that this is somewhat related to that netting process that I mentioned, where Kroger is taking charges that they have created that are due to Kroger, like ORAD, post audits, promotional allowances, returns, all these charges from Kroger. They're balancing those charges against what they owe to you from your own invoices. And they're, kind of creating that balance. And so sometimes you'll get a $0 check. Sometimes it'll be a check that's, somewhat less than what you billed. And I think that settlement portion kind of relates to that netting process of them netting various charges against each other.
Gotcha. Okay, that's helpful. Another question before we got to jump off. I'm racing against the clock. Most of our shipments are dropped trailer. Then they are denied. Any suggestions?
So if you're drop trailer, I assume you're getting like some shortage deductions. You're trying to dispute those. It is hard to get stamped POD if you're dropped because they're not unloading the goods at the time the carrier is there. So they're not necessarily stamping a document. What we have seen some suppliers do is actually email these Kroger DCs and request stamped PODs for individual POs. And we've heard mixed success with that. Sometimes they're slow to respond. They don't always respond, but sometimes you do actually get those stamped PODs back to you from the Kroger DC. So it's worth a shot to reach out to them to see if they can get you that documentation. So that's maybe where I would start if you're sort of struggling with getting the right documentation.
Yeah, and follow up to that. If you can't get your stamped POD or you do get it and for some reason Kroger is not okay with using that as proof documentation, what would be some of the other resources that a supplier could use?
So it's a little bit tough. It's hard to escalate in Levante. You have kind of limited abilities. You almost, I would say, if you're really hitting a brick wall with Levante, number one, you can ask questions on deductions. You can submit questions in Levante and get some responses. You could also use your merchant or buyer with Kroger and try to kind of escalate some scenarios when it's a significant issue. And you have reason to think it's kind of invalid, then that's probably the resources I would go to next outside of Levante. So, ask questions in Levante when you can, dispute. If you hit a brick wall, then you probably need to reach out to some of your Kroger contacts to try to escalate individual issues.
Perfect. Thanks for that. And again, we have other webinars and information on this. I know we didn't go too deep into the disputing process, but thanks for that great outline on some of those best practices and the deductions you can receive at Kroger. We are at time. Ryan, you did fantastic, and we'll see each other in 30 minutes, I believe, for Amazon Deductions 101. Yeah. Thanks so much. Bye.